Hello and welcome to this very overdue and unfortunately titled video, part 2 of my work in Stargate project. I realise I say this in many of my videos, but I really do apologise for the delay in getting this made. I will go into detail in this video, but for now I will say this project has been a right pain in the arse several times over, and I had many false starts in making a part 2 video throughout the year. A lot of work has been done and I've been able to record most of the progress. So much has been done throughout the year, so I will be splitting this part 2 into its own 2 parts, the second part of this update coming shortly after I've posted this, as I don't want to bore people to tears with an excessively long video. So what have I been doing? As I left you in part 1, I had completed the design of the Stargate itself, the dialing rings, the chevrons and the chevron locking mechanism. And while 1 or 2 small tweaks had been made to the design since then, that part had been mostly locked down. I then proceeded to design the base pedestal of the Stargate. Now, this is the Earth Gate, and I had to decide if I wanted to make this look like something out of the SGC, or if I wanted to put it into one of the stone pedestals similar to the ones seen off-world. I decided to go with the off-world look, as it will make it easier to hide all the electronics and the moving parts inside. I started off with designing a hollow box shape, finding the right size that would fit both the Stargate and fit the table I wanted to sit this on, the well-known and infamous IKEA lack table. Once I had the box designed, I modelled in the framework that will hold the Stargate and figured out the mounts for the stepper motors and servo pulleys for the chevron mechanism. I then took my CAD design, converted it to a low poly model, and then I tessellated it into a dense mesh that I could sculpt onto. I started off with just marking out the cobbled stone pattern to guide me, after which I bulged out the stones and added fractal patterns onto them, which helped give the whole thing a good stone-based look. I had always planned to FDM print this part, and I knew it would lose a lot of details, but I wanted enough detail to work with, so when I post-processed the part, I could fix and correct the shortcomings of the FDM print while still having a good guide to model from. And I ended up with a nice looking sculpt, which I then had to optimise so I could take the stupidly high milling poly mesh and import it into a slicer, of which I started printing the parts. While the pedestal parts were printing, I began printing of the resin parts, starting with the Stargate symbols. And while those were printing, I quickly put together a post-print UV cure chamber out of some scrapped wood. While it wouldn't win any awards for aesthetics, it does get the job done and has been really useful, and you've seen me use this already in my subscriber counter video. My first print did fail as my supports were too small, so I resliced and made another print. Several prints later, the symbols were all printed and cured inside the chamber. I was well on my way to printing the steps of the Stargate when my printer ran out of filament. And here was one of my first real issues. On the firmware the printer was running, the filament runout sensor parks the print head for filament changing. All well and good. The only trouble is, the firmware also powers off the motors after a minute, so unless you're already there ready to swap out filament, by the time you come and find your printer has run out, the motors have disengaged and the print head freely moves. And inevitably, by changing the filament you make the printer lose track of where it is in 3D space, so when the print is resumed, it's misaligned. Now, I did manage to catch this and roughly corrected it by forcing the stepper motor to skip a few steps. So I did have this obvious flaw in the print, but no terrible harm was done, and I was going to go over the model with a hot iron anyway to resculpt in all the details. I have since updated the firmware and corrected the settings in Marlin to stop this happening in the future. Oh, and if you're wondering why I'm still using the Sidewinder, it's because my rod core rail printer is still out of commission. Something I really want to fix, especially now as it's starting to come out that the Sidewinder might be a bit of a fire hazard. If you have one, make sure that your chassis is grounded and your bed heater cables are not kinking. Anyway, the outside pedestal was printed in PLA, and I'm well aware of PLA's shortcomings to warping over time as it softens on hot days, so during the modelling process I split the internal Stargate mounting framework from the outside stone details and printed the frame parts in PETG, giving a good solid mount for the Stargate, seen here in orange. Once everything was printed, I cleaned up the edges and removed any bulges from the corner of the frame and glued the outside stone parts to the inner frame and clamped it. I used 2-part epoxy glue, so there was no way this would come apart in the future, and even if the PLA was to get a little soft on a hot day, the PETG will keep everything in place. After I printed the Stargate symbols on the photon, it was time to get to the really awkward bit, the bulk of the Stargate detailed parts. And this is where things started to get very awkward, and ultimately my downfall in this project. See, the thing is, the Anycubic Photon is not a big printer, neither are most of the LCD-based SLA printers out there, as nearly all of them use mobile phone displays to mask and cure the prints. This typically means you have a print area of around a 5-inch display, which is 120mm by 68mm. Not a very large print area at all. Certainly not large enough to print these parts needed for the Stargate. So when I was designing the front and back faces of the Stargate, I made a point of separating the greebly bits behind the chevrons from the front and back faces. This removes just enough height, so when I orientated the parts to print tall, it just fits within the build volume of the printer. While this did mean I could print these on the printer, this did introduce a huge drawback. My print times ended up being really rather long. While some people have been able to get their layer cure times down to 8 to 12 seconds on their photon, I found my printer anything below 15 seconds would usually fail, and after a few attempts testing some other resins and lower cure times, this indeed still was the case. So I had to keep my layer cure times at 15 seconds, and ultimately, as I was printing tool and using nearly the entire Z space, this meant that each face would take around 38 hours to print. And with 24 of these tool prints to do, plus several of the inner segments of the ring, I knew that printing all these parts on my photon just wasn't feasible. So for the next stage of my downfall, I had to come up with a reasonable way to make all the parts. Years ago in my teens, I experimented with resin casting and silicon mold making, with some limited success. So I thought, what better way to make all my parts quickly than to print off some originals and make silicon molds of them and cast resin duplicates. And at the time, it also appeared that this may be a cheaper option as 3D printer resin is rather expensive. Here in the UK, Smooth-On, the popular American brand that everyone seems to use, which also appears to be a lot more affordable over there, as so many makers have wasted lots of it on failed castings, certainly isn't affordable over here, appearing to be more than twice the price as it is over there. However, I did find a local company that is really rather popular, called Easy Composites. And it appears to be nearly as affordable as things are in America. At the time, it still seemed to be the best affordable and time-saving option I had, so this is what I set out to do. I printed off the original high detailed parts that I wanted to resin cast and duplicate on the printer. These were the main front and back faces of the Stargate, along with the greebly bits printed separately and then glued to the faces, as well as the centre greeble ring that protruded around the outside of the gate. Once these parts were printed, I primed and sanded them down to hide the layer lines and then prepped them for silicon moulding. I started off with measuring out and cutting some foam board, which will make the base of my mould box. Using plasticine, I built up the bases and suspended the parts I wanted to cast, after which I spent a very long time cleaning up the edges around the printed parts so I'd have a good negative to pour silicon against. I then hot glued the sides of the box on and filled up the edges with more plasticine and pressed in keys for the mould to lock to. I was now ready to pour my silicon. In an attempt to save costs and not have to buy more silicon, I looked into ways of bulking silicon up and found phyllite. This stuff can usually be used to bulk out and fill resins, but it can also be used for silicon. Normally silicon would only bond to itself and usually only when in a liquid state, but phyllite is so fine a material it blends well with the silicon. The end result is a stiffer silicon with more volume, which was also good because this meant I could make a smaller mould while still retaining a strong mould. But there is a downside. You can't easily degas phyllite silicon, so it would not be good when casting under pressure. But also because the phyllite is not great for grabbing details on original parts, so when I poured my silicon I did it in 2 stages. First I mixed in half my silicon with the hardener and poured as normal, trying to pour a long thin string to remove any trapped air bubbles. This would be pure silicon capturing all the details of the parts. I then mixed in the other half of the silicon with hardener, and this time added several large unmeasured spoonfuls of phyllite and spent a good while mixing it in, knackering out my wrists in the process as it made it very difficult to stir. This silicon had a rather long working time, so I wasn't worried about it setting while mixing. Once the phyllite was mixed in and the whole lot looked like fresh cake mix, I then poured this on top of the virgin silicon, focusing on filling in the cavity areas of the mould. I then gave this a little stir so the virgin and phyllite silicone would blend well, and I left it to set over the next 2 days. While this first half of the mould was setting, I took this time to start laser cutting the gate's framework. And here I made a stupid little mistake. At this point I'm fairly new to laser cutting and still experimenting with different approaches to things. In an earlier test when laser cutting the Durlin plastic, I had noticed when the laser hit the honeycomb mesh bed it would cause a little flare. This in turn reflected into the plastic, leaving a little notch. So to try and combat this, I used more of that recycled wood that I used to make my cure chamber and tried doing a cut with the plastic sitting on top of this wood, completely ignoring the fact that this wood has some very old paint on it. Anyway, while no real damage was done, this did leave a lot of nasty sticky hard residue on my plastic parts, which I had to sand and clean off. Oops. After a couple of days I went back to the silicon mould and started carefully removing the box sides, saving the foam board for when I flip over the mould. I removed as much of the plasticine as I could before scraping the residue and ultimately using some IPA to remove what I couldn't scrape away. This was also when I discovered that the cheap white hobby primer that I used to seal my print parts in for the silicon dissolved under the light solvents like IPA. Again, no harm was done as this was the underside of the part. After the cleanup, I hot glued the sides of the mould backs back on and started hot gluing chopped up kebab sticks to key points of the back of the parts. These sticks represent channels for trapped air to come out of when I inject the resin into the mould. I then mixed up the silicon and proceeded to pour the mould just as before. And as you can see, 1 or 2 of the sticks detached from the parts. Joy. I was using this cheap primer as it gave a nice smooth finish, but it appears it also gave too smooth a finish, so the hot glue didn't adhere too well to it. Oh well, I started so I had to finish. I picked out the sticks and carried on pouring. I then put this aside and carried on laser cutting the frame parts of the gate. I should mention it was shortly before this time that I discovered that the Durlin plastic sheets that I had were somewhat bowed, so I had to hope that it was something I could countermeasure when sandwiching all the parts and bolting it together. I am told this bow is normal, but that could be the shop where I bought this from trying to take away any responsibility. I am still too inexperienced with lasering to be sure. Anyway, because of this bow I had to drill a hole in the centre of the sheet and bolt it down to the honeycomb bed so the laser would keep focus and not cause any strange artifacts. And of course I had to triple check to make sure that I had to put the bolt in a negative space and out the path of any lasering. I then proceeded to cut my parts, which actually went smoothly. Or so I thought. Find out how everything else went wrong and how I screwed up in part 2 of this part 2, which should be online in the next few days. Of course, my projects are not cheap and I have no real income to speak of. I skimp and save where I can and do things on the cheap where possible. And truth be told, I could not have got this far without the help I've already received from the donations through my GoFundMe and my Patreon. But it really is still very early days for relying on that income, and I had to spend more money than I can afford to do my builds. This Stargate project has been a particularly expensive project for me, and I'd really like to reach out for anyone who would like to help support this project and my future projects. If you feel you want to help support me in this project and my other projects, please consider making a donation on my GoFundMe or sign up to my Patreon page. Both links are in the description. If you're not already, please also consider subscribing so to catch my future videos. The boost in subscriptions I have seen lately have been a great driver for me to put in the effort and long hours needed to make my builds, and this has been needed, as in this and in the next video will show. It's sometimes difficult to find the motivation to continue a project when so many things go wrong. So to know that my projects are at least of interest to people really pushes me through the challenges I face. As always, thank you for watching. Stay safe, take care, and until next time, goodbye.